Our next and last speaker is Randy Olson, who also grubbed around on the bottom of the ocean as a marine biologist for a while. He left a tenured professor position at the University of New Hampshire to return to the University of Southern California Film School, where he honed his art, has produced a couple of really well-received documentaries, one of which you may have seen here at Ragtag, The Flock of Dodos. And now is really convinced that he can convince you that telling your story as a story is the way to go. So here's Randy Olson.
Thanks. Cool. Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to come here. Thanks for sticking around. This is the final little session here, and we're going to try and have some fun. This has been like a tutorial in science communication for me all afternoon, sitting here listening to these incredible talks. And I'll try and draw on a few things, and so I'm kind of be modifying a little bit of this presentation as we go along. Particularly Liz's material, and you know, she talked about the big, broad World Wide Web that is so amazing and diverse and all over the place. And to some extent, this is kind of a good companion talk to go with that, because what I'm talking about is sort of the polar opposite, which is the more cerebral side of trying to take all that stuff and squash it down and see what patterns you can see there. And there's word narratives that's emerged in the last 10 years. And for those of us who were around in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, nobody talked about narratives. I guarantee you go through all of Walter Cronkite's original news broadcasts, you never would have heard him talking about the Vietnam War narrative or the space race narrative. It is a word of the past decade, and I think it goes hand in hand with everything that Liz was going through, which is out of this giant morass and miasma and cloud of all this crazy activity, people are now desperately searching for those patterns more than ever, and that's what narratives are. They start to emerge as seeing large-scale patterns. So let's see, were we going to bring the house lights down a little bit here? And I'm just going to begin with a message from the President of the United States.
The mistake of my first couple of years was thinking that this job was just about getting the policy right. And that's important. But you know, the nature of this office is also to tell a story to the American people.
So there you have it, from the President himself. That was in the summer 2012 interview with Charlie Rose, in which he asked him the same question that had been asked of Bush, which is, what was the biggest mistake of your first term? And he, I think, had been carefully scripted to pick something that wouldn't be too damaging to say that I failed to tell a story to the American public. But that is the basic dynamic, is this need to tell stories, and you're hearing it everywhere nowadays. We must tell stories. And in fact, it's getting to be borderline annoying, because everybody's going around and saying, we need you to tell your stories. And the problem is, the vast majority of people, as far as I can tell, almost everybody doing it, is not really giving you the mechanism, the machinery, how to tell these stories so much better, other than, you know, make them lively, make them grab people. We want them to be human and want them to be concise and yet compelling, and all these different sorts of vague, nebulous things. You hear a lot of that sort of stuff in Hollywood. But there is an element of science and mechanics to the telling of stories. That's what we're going to get into here today. And let's see, before we do, I just want to start off with a couple little samples just to kind of lighten the afternoon of some work that I've done in the past. I'm going to tell you in a few minutes about my whole journey from being a scientist to becoming a filmmaker. But a lot of the early work that I did was involved with ocean conservation, and I partnered with a famous coral reef ecologist named Jeremy Jackson. We created a campaign called the Shifting Baselines Ocean Media Project. And we built, basically, I constructed all this media to try and promote this one term that we felt was super important, which is shifting baselines. It was coined in 1995 by an oceanographer. And it refers to the idea that baselines are reference points from the past. And if we start to lose track of these reference points, we start to forget what the past looks like, then how can you ever do conservation? How can you walk out into a forest and say we're going to restore this thing when you never knew what it was like in the beginning? And this is happening over and over again in today's era of tons and tons of information. So in the fall of 2002, I wrote an op-ed that was published in the LA Times, and at that point I searched on Google and there was only one mention of this term, shifting baselines. Today, when you search, you'll find hundreds of pages and tons of essays and articles and everything. So we were a part in helping to promote that term for broader use, and throughout the conservation community, it's widely used now, and it's a very powerful term. There's a broader kind of version of it, which is the new normal, I think, that you hear a lot of people saying, but this has got more power to it because of the word baselines in there. So these are two basically television commercials that I produced, wrote and directed early on as part of this campaign, both of which aired on television stations across the country. So let's see, here's the first one, which was called the Ocean Symphony. This is 60 seconds long, if we can get the lights down for this one.
Elegance, beauty, grace, precision. We expect this from a symphony, especially in the hands of an absolute genius. Like this? We would never accept this level of quality. So when it comes to our oceans, why are we willing to call this beautiful when it used to look like this? It's called a shifting baseline. We're forgetting how the oceans used to look. To learn more, visit shiftingbaselines.org. Before the oceans end up like this.
Okay. And that commercial, that public service announcement, we released actually the same month that Jack Black's movie School for Rock, that was Jack Black there, the conductor, the same month that his movie School for Rock debuted #1 at the box office. The result was, over the next year and a half, over $10 million in free airtime across the country. And, you know, interestingly, why was that commercial aired so broadly and so widely? Was it because the messaging was so skillful and crafty and we got it down to the exact words that you had to get out there? No, it's because everybody loves Jack Black, and he was popular, and sometimes that's as much as you need, is a voice that is liked and even trusted, and it can carry the message for you. I went on the year after that and did another public service announcement. This one's a little bit more focused and a little more, because, you know, the content of that one is kind of light. This one's got a tiny bit more content, and if we can get the lights down again for this one, this was called the Tiny Fish PSA.
So what'd you catch?
Hit the mother lode today.
You've got to be kidding. Do I even need the gauge? I haven't seen fish this big in years. Okay, it's not this bad. But ocean fish today are not as big as they used to be. It's a problem, but there are proposed solutions, such as MPAs, underwater national parks. Do they work? To find out, visit shiftingbaselines.org. Before we end up like this.
You think of what I'm thinking?
Mm-hmm.
Lots of fishermen did not laugh at that. When it was released in the fall of 2005 on the Central California coast, we got a barrage of hate phone calls and emails and everything from the fishing community, which was great because it opened up a channel of communication for me. Arouse and fulfill, the basic principle. First, you got to arouse people's interest, and then you can begin to communicate with them. I followed that up by talking to some of them over the phone. Eventually, we put together a crew, went up there, sat down with 5 of the fishermen, let them air their grievances, and put together a short video called the Fisherman's Reply. And that's how you use media, actually actively do something to open doors and enhance communication. So my basic journey, talking about storytelling, is from the science world to the world of cinema. I did my graduate work at Harvard University, worked on coral reef ecology, and lived in Australia for a number of years. Eventually became a professor at the University of New Hampshire, and then something happened. I underwent a transition and decided to resign from my tenured professorship, leave it all behind, moved to Los Angeles, entered into film school at the University of Southern California, Went through the whole graduate production program there for 3 years, 3 of the most fun years of my entire life. It was a ball to be in this class of 50 students. I was 38 years old. They were all 21, 22 years old, and they're still my closest friends in Hollywood. And then I got out and stumbled around for a few years until connecting with Jeremy Jackson, creating that Shifting Baselines campaign, and that led in 2005 to my making a documentary feature film called Flock of Dodos. As he mentioned, we screened it here in 2009. I followed that with another feature that was a mockumentary called Sizzle, a global warming comedy. And then ended up writing a book called Don't Be Such a Scientist, Talking Substance and Age of Style in 2009. And you know, what I've just run through there for you really, in essence, is a whole bunch, a sundry list of facts, basically. And I just strung it all together, and then I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this. And some of those things you might have found interesting, some of you might have found even curious, and yet together, the way I presented it there really is just a list of facts. It's like a chronology. It changes when we put it into a broader context and actually find a theme to what went on, which is you can look at me as sort of like a transplantation experiment. I am a human being whose brain was developed and cultivated in a non-narrative environment called the profession of science, and then transplanted to the narrative world when I moved to Hollywood. And actually the transition was a little more slow than that, but that's the basic essence. And lots of scientists will argue with that and say, oh, it's not a non-narrative world. Well, it is. There's these basic ethics that work against storytelling, narrative, and it's kind of weird because the scientific method is a narrative process, and yet, as a profession, it really fights against narrative. And so it took me quite a long time to figure out this whole idea because there was a time lag, basically. I've been cultivated in one environment and then transplanted. And so I began the transition in 1989. That was when I first started making films, started winning awards, going to film festivals, deciding I was very serious about this. And the question is, when did I finally figure out how this story stuff works? Because I took all these courses, listened to it, and it's incredibly elusive. And furthermore, there's 2 parts to it. There's the cerebral part, which is the start for you, but then it's about moving it down into the visceral. It's the stuff that Malcolm Gladwell talks about for the real professionals. It can take you 10,000 hours to really make this transition from the cerebral to the visceral. And so when did that finally happen for me? The answer is not in those late professor years when I was making the first films. It didn't happen in film school. It didn't happen in the years after that. It didn't even happen in making those short films there that I showed you. I still didn't quite understand how stories work. It didn't really happen until 2005 with my movie Flock of Dodos. I'll try and tell you briefly about that in a little while. But that's how tough it is. And this is one of the things I'm trying to explain to the science world is everybody's running around talking about storytelling and narrative and all this stuff. But what I'm hearing is the vast majority of people don't get it. They don't really, a lot of the instructors don't have the background to really kind of get the depth and complexity of this. And yet, if you can commit to it, it's extremely powerful in the long term. So this is what happened for me then, was that just like Barack Obama and all these other people going around telling people you need to be better storytellers, I wrote this book, and the 3rd chapter of the book was called Don't Be Such a Poor Storyteller. And people began to kind of make semi-sniping comments about, nice book, but all you really did was criticize us. You know, you said we're lousy at telling stories. Why don't you give us some idea how to do this? And my answer was, I don't know how to do it at that point. And it took me then a few more years to figure it out. And the real breakthrough for me happened in a number of science institutions began to invite me because of the book to come do workshops, and they'd say, what do you want to do a workshop on? And I'd say, well, you know, it ought to be storytelling. And then I thought to myself, I don't really quite understand how it works. So I recruited 2 co-instructors, and interestingly, rather than recruiting a couple of professors, I could have at USC found a communications professor and a theater professor. But again, communication you could split into the cerebral and the visceral, and I already had the cerebral side pretty well covered. What I needed help with was the more visceral side. What the entire world of science needs help with is the visceral side. The informational side is not that tough, and they're doing a great job in the science world. What they're lacking is the visceral stuff. And so what I did was recruit 2 actors, because it's their job day in and day out to make stories work. Their entire livelihood depends upon their ability to understand story, make it work in the real world on a daily basis. That doesn't happen for academics. It's nice if professors are good storytellers, but their livelihood does not depend upon them being able to do that. And I should say, actually, at this point, this note that I'm pushing on, the need for these partnerships between the scientists and the artists, one of the best embodiments of that right now, I think, is what SUNY Stony Brook has done with their Center for Science Communication. They've named it after Alan Alda, and he's now the voice of that. And there you go. You know, he's not a scientist. He's very much like these two folks who are actors. And then the two of them turn out to kind of have the world of storytelling split into these two dimensions as well. So Dory Barton is actress. She's been in lots of movies like Meet the Fockers and Bewitched and Legally Blonde 2. But she's also got an expertise in narrative structure. She works with screenwriters, helping them shape their stories. She knows the works of Joseph Campbell backwards and forwards. And that's the cerebral part of storytelling. Brian Palermo is a longtime improv actor. If you saw the movie The Social Network, he played the computer science professor there that gets in a spat with Mark Zuckerberg. And he used to be on Jay Leno a whole bunch. So he's a great actor, but also longtime member of the Groundlings Improv Comedy Theater, which is one of the two giant improv training grounds in this country. And his expertise is in improv, and improv is the other end of the spectrum. It is the set of exercises and techniques that help you come down out of your head, get down into this lower realm, the more humanized realm. So together, we teamed up, and I began learning a ton of stuff from them. We started doing these workshops 4 years ago. We wrote a book last fall called Connection, and we titled it Connection because that's really what happened. We connected with our brains. And by the way, the reason we connected really well is because I put in 25 years to make myself bilingual in these two worlds of both science and filmmaking. And as a result, I'm able to speak with them on an even keel. I've taken the acting classes, I've done the auditions, I know the managers, the agents, I know their world backwards and forwards. And the result of that is we're able to get together and chat on everything, and I'm not mystified by their life at all. I can feel their pain because I know what they've been through. So this book ends up, as I said, you know, I didn't know as I wrote it so much, but over the years, people began to point out, all you did was criticize us. You're right. I pinpointed what I thought some of the major problems in science communication, but now we have this new book in which we're offering up an actual mechanistic solution. As far as I know, nobody else has got anything like this, and I'm going to get into some of the specifics now, and I hope that I'm going to give some of you that are interested in communication at least one or two very specific tools that will make a difference in the way that you communicate if you put them to work. So all of this kind of fits under this basic heading of story development, and it's this idea that the real world gives you a bunch of information that's basically shaped like a square peg, and your challenge as a communicator is to take that square peg and shape it into a cylinder, and that everybody's brains have got these cylindrical receptors. And that's the challenge in very simple forms, and I think you really should kind of commit that to your own instinct and intuition, because so many people end up taking the square peg, and that's all the work they ever do, and they just try and ram that square peg into your brain by just giving you tons of information. But the irony is that the science world itself figured this out long ago, and every science paper that you write in any major science journal, they have a template that they force you into to make sure that you at least come close to approximating that cylindrical form. When you write a paper, they've got writer's guidelines that you have to write it into the introduction. It has to be these four major sections, you know, introduction, results, methods, or methods, results, and discussion. And there's no getting around that. You know, editors enforce that rule. So they've figured it out, at least in the written world, of the formal written world of journals. So let me begin this discussion of story development and the goals of it by using a voice from the heart of the science world. So this amazing geneticist, Theodosius Dobzhansky, was a Russian, emigrated to the US, and was a major part of the modern synthesis, the work that he did, and influenced tons of today's geneticists. But there's a famous quote for him that some of you may know that was in my intro ecology and evolution textbook long ago, and I remembered it. In fact, I used it in my movie Flock of Dodos. I kind of modified it in there. And the famous quote is that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And known that quote for a long time, thought it was kind of cool, but only about 3 months ago did I really start to research it and came across the actual speech that he first, well, it was an essay, I think, or a speech for like the American biology teacher, and in 1964. And in the paper, there's a more detailed version of this. And I think, I would suggest this could be one of the most powerful things in all of science communication. I am going to try and advocate this in the near future and push this quote, because this more detailed quote tells you most of what you need to know for effective broad communication over the long term. So at the top you see, seen in the light of evolution, biology is perhaps intellectually the most satisfying, inspiring science, basically repeating what that quote was. It's the bottom part that's fascinating. What he says is, without that light, It becomes a pile of sundry facts. I love that phrase. I can think of other piles of things it could become. Some of them interesting or curious, but making no meaningful picture as a whole. Now, let's break this down the same way that an actor would break down a script, where you look at the individual phrases and the words and what they're meaning, what they're saying. And here's the starting point, is that evolution is what he's pointing to as the narrative, and that's what it is. Evolution is the narrative of biology. It is the story of biology. It's the way that we make sense of all these different diverse creatures by knowing this one unifying narrative thread, which is evolution. And then down here, he's saying that without that narrative thread, without that light, without the knowledge of evolution, it becomes a pile of sundry facts, which is basically non-narrative. Some of them interesting or curious, but making no meaningful picture as a whole. And when you start to absorb this and think it through, you begin to see so many presentations, so many films, so many documentaries. They are packed full of interesting facts. An awful lot of science communication presents interesting facts, some of which are really interesting and really curious, and yet there doesn't seem to be an overarching kind of pattern, a narrative that makes sense out of it. And that's the challenge to you in broad communication, is it's easy to find a whole pile of interesting, curious facts, but can you crack the nut up there? What is the narrative? What's the bigger context? And these are the sorts of things Liz was kind of pointing to in her talk as well. So it's about finding these narratives that make sense out of these worlds, these oceans of information floating around. And towards that end, I want to tell you now about the tool that we have discovered out of our workshop in the past 2.5 years that I think is incredibly powerful. And I am in the process now of promoting this all over the place. And I want to present it to you first off in a simple little sentence here. So once upon a time, there was a group of science folks at Mizzou, and they did lots of good work, but communicating research is always a challenge. Therefore, they decided to take part in the Connection Story Making Workshop, which we ran yesterday, a version of. You can't see the red there, sorry, but in red it says and, but, and therefore. And this is a template. We now call it the ABT template. I'm beginning to believe it's a universal narrative template. A little over 2 years ago when I first came across it, I searched it on Google and I didn't find anything for and, but, and therefore. Today we're starting to propagate it out there. And the way we're propagating it is through this ABT. I gave a TED Med talk on it last spring. In December, I had a letter in Science about the ABT. And it's a simple template that seems to give you the ability to distill down any complicated story all the way down into its core essence. And that's the starting point for effective broad communication, is to know what are you arguing, what are you presenting at the core, and everything can be distilled down to a single sentence like that. It may be missing a lot of the details and information. You can then radiate back outwards there. But realize that the challenge in communication is not complexity, it's simplicity. That's the hard part, is can you take the big chunk of information and find something simple at the core of it. So this is one of the exercises that we then do. And do you guys have the microphone? You got a microphone? Okay. So ordinarily I would run through the audience seeking volunteers on these sorts of exercises, but because everybody's all spread out here today and we got limited time, I have my 3 volunteers here, 3 of our speakers. So I am going to ask, everybody's backing off. So Dominique, yes. And so this is one of the exercises we do in the workshop, which is to just take an interesting image and ask people to use this template to tell the story of what you see up there. Now, if you ask people just point blank, tell me what you see there, they have a tendency to go on and on and on. Well, I see a picture, there's a window, there's 3 people, there's some tables, there's this, there's this, there's this. They're not quite sure what they're looking for. The ABT gives you a clear narrative agenda, and on that note, I'm going to ask Liz to give us her version of an ABT for this painting here.
You're changing the rules on us again.
What's that?
That's not what you told us to do.
Oh no, that's the second exercise. Oh, okay. This one's a surprise. You've got to learn to be spontaneous. That's part of the improv training. Throwing you a curveball. Yeah. Come on, you can do it.
Yeah,
we do this in the workshop. Here we go.
There's a meeting of 3 people on a noir, dark evening. And they're in the midst of a conversation, but she's having none of it.
Therefore, the scene will be resolved in a gunfight. Perfect, all right. Action, right. Action climax to this scene. Precisely. Are either of the 2 of you brave enough to give it another shot?
I think that we should go on and do the things that we prepared.
Oh, well, that's kind of cruel of me. Dominique.
I'll give a shot.
Give it a shot,
I'll give it a
Dominique.
shot.
Yes.
3 people were talking about science communication and nobody cared about what they were saying. Therefore,
No, but
I know, but the guy with the vest thought he was right. Therefore, the woman got really upset.
perfect. Exactly. All right, thank you very much for being brave. Now, actually, okay, Barbara. Now if you're hopefully brave enough, one more.
A bit.
Give it a shot. And button therefore.
Emily was on the playground having fun with her friend, and her friend was jealous of her, but a boy came in and broke up the fight. Therefore, she has a black eye.
Perfect. Exactly. That's excellent. And everybody was right in there listening to you. And basically what was happening is your brain flipped over into the narrative side of your brain. You were in story mode there. You were looking for the elements. What's that?
My brain is dead.
Oh, you're right. We reactivated it for a minute there. But that's what it's about. That's what this little device does. And so we've got these two different worlds, the non-narrative world, which is and, which is just listing, if you just described everything, a girl, bench, chair, guy, blah, 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 and. And then there's this much more challenging, difficult world, the narrative world, and the ABT flips you in there. And you could see, I mean, it's really tough for all three of you. It took some extra thought. And yet, the nice thing is nobody got lost, nobody got bored. It was concise, it was compelling. That's the power of this little tool. Now, here's one of the stunning things. There's a professor in the business school at Arizona State named Park Howell who read our book last fall and flipped over it. He's become my good buddy. We trade emails and discussions every 2 or 3 weeks. And you can't probably see the actual text from there. But it turns out the Gettysburg Address is an ABT, honest to goodness. This is one of the most important famous speeches in American history. Last fall was the 150th anniversary of delivering it. What it's known for is its brevity. He showed up on horseback, he gave this short little speech, 3 paragraphs, got on the horse and rode off. But when you look closely, or when you look at the text, what it says, you see the first paragraph up here. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. But now we are engaged. So Park actually added the word but there, but you can feel it, it fits right in there. But now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, yada, yada, yada. And down here, he's added the word therefore, but it also fits. Therefore, in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate on and on. And also the reason that it worked is this is not a new thing. This goes back 2,000 years to the Greeks. It's the basic core idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's the way that it's at the core of argumentation. It's the core of logic. It's everything. It's the way our brains are programmed to receive these things. You lay out the one thing, the thesis, then you take us to the polar opposite. We're in the middle of a civil war, and then you bring it together in the synthesis of, quite often what we need to do. So it is everywhere. Now, here's a fascinating thing that we've discovered. We started doing these workshops last fall using the ABT, and using the app that we use, we have people put together before they get to the workshop, their story broken down into the one word I'll talk about in a little while, one sentence and one paragraph. And what we find is that we start counting the number of characters in ABTs, and think of this, it is people taking their story, shrinking it down to one sentence, the most concise sentence they can, and it's uncanny. The sentences are about 300 to 350 characters. And that's what people seem to need in order to take an interesting thought and shrink it down to its core elements. Then you can think about how many characters in Twitter? 140. And where did that 140 number come from? Anybody know? Texting, which is how many characters? 160, exactly. And where did the 160 come from? There was an article in the LA Times a couple months ago about some guy in Germany in the mid-'80s, read a bunch of postcards and counted the number of characters in those, and that was, they think, the starting point for that number. The key point was that it was not put together by an international committee of narratology experts. It was put together by technology. And there's technological reasons for that being the length of it. And it makes you begin to wonder about this divide between the desire to try and tell a cohesive thought and story versus this very short thing. And I don't know beyond that, but I do know a lot of people are beginning to question how long Twitter will be around. And I wonder if that isn't a potential shortcoming of it. So we've created something that we call out of our workshops the ABTshare Project. It's a Facebook page. And it's just a place where people from our workshops, just the last 2 or 3 weeks, we started having them post ABTs on there because it's working wonders for lots of people in their communication. So it's a Facebook page. You can go there and see what other people are doing to use that. So back to the ABT. How did I come across this? It came to me not by this guy, but by this guy. Trey Parker, the co-creator of South Park, in a little over 2 years ago, Comedy Central ran a documentary on the making of South Park. And in there, he talked about what he called his rule of replacing. And he said, here's the deal. I get a first script of the episode for the week. I sit down and I try and I go back into it and try and replace the word and with either but or therefore, any place I can through the script. Every time I can remove an and replace it with a but or therefore, the storytelling gets more interesting. When I heard that, I was stunned. I've never heard storytelling brought all the way down, and I'm a fan of simplicity. And I wrote it down, and I called up Dory, and she said, I've never heard it put that simple, but it's actually fairly similar to something called the logline maker that I'll be telling you about in a few minutes. And from there, then, I'm on the warpath of figuring out where did this come from. Because I found another little video of Matt and Trey talking at NYU about how they learned this from their screenwriting teachers. Well, I think I've gotten to the text, basically, the ultimate source, which is a famous screenwriting instructor named Frank Daniel. He was from Czechoslovakia. He emigrated and he established the screenwriting program at Columbia University and then was hired by USC a few years before I got there. I was lucky enough to have his course the year before he passed away. He was tremendous. And at his funeral, David Lynch gave the eulogy and just said this is the greatest screenwriting instructor ever. And so just a couple of months ago, one of my friends came across the transcript of a speech that Frank Daniel gave from 1986. It's a 24-page transcript, and buried in the middle of it are these 2 paragraphs. And this is really powerful, important stuff, I think. Take a look at what he's saying here. Monotony is a problem in first drafts. There are several reasons for it. One usually is the fact that the scenes follow in the forbidden pattern, and then, and that's the definition of sitting there listening to somebody go on and on and on. And then we did this, and you're wanting them to get to the point. This next paragraph then says, in such a case, immediately you have monotony. In a dramatic story, the pattern usually for the connecting scenes is and then, but, therefore, but, and towards the culmination meanwhile. If you don't have this but and therefore connection between the parts, the story becomes linear, monotonous. And here's the important point, I put it in red here. Diaries and chronicles are written that way. Also, laboratory notebooks and journals are written that way, but not scripts, not research papers, and ideally not presentations as well. Again, that's that transition from the square peg into the rounded cylinder to try and make this stuff work. So there's the divide, and versus ABT. And now I want to talk a little bit about the dynamics of these 3 words in the context of what exactly is a story, because the subtitle of our book is Hollywood Storytelling Meets Critical Thinking. And that's our partnership. They are Hollywood storytelling. I've brought the critical thinking from my science training. And this was one of the pivotal moments for me, was when my book came out, I got invited to spend a day at the Centers for Disease Control, which was one of my life's dreams. I've always been fascinated by epidemiology. And in getting ready for that, I had phone calls with a number of their communications people. It's an incredible facility there, 10,000 employees, 50 buildings, and 500 communications folks. It's really kind of one of the major meccas of science communication in our society. And in talking with one of them, she said to me, here's the problem. And what you get at these big science institutions, by the way, is cultural divide. You have the scientists that are very informational and the communications people that are much more visceral, and really a big divide quite often. And she said, we go and sit down with the scientists and we ask them, what would you like us to communicate to the general public? And invariably they say to us, we want you to tell the story of the CDC. And we say back to them, what is the story of the CDC? And they throw their hands up and say, it's all the drugs that we develop here, it's the diseases we cure, it's the awards that we win. And we have to say back to them, that's not a story, that's a resume, that's a list of accomplishments, but it's basically and. A story begins when something happens. And that's what we're talking about with this and, but, and therefore. And this is an exercise now we're going to do, which we do, now we're getting to what I prepped you for, so sorry about that. We do this in our workshops, and a story begins when something happens. So a story, in its simplest of all forms, consists of 3 acts, beginning, middle, and an end. You start a story by laying out some facts called exposition, and then something happens that's going to pose a question that will begin the story then. So we're going to do this little start a story exercise, and I encourage you to do this with students, in classes or something like that if you want to talk about narrative. These same things seem so elementary school, and yet this is the ruling dynamic in broad communication. So everybody gets 1 sentence to start a story, and my 3 volunteers, I'm going to begin by telling you a story, and I get 1 and 1 but. So, and it could be true or false, by the way, the 3 of you. This morning, I took a walk in my neighborhood, and I saw my neighbor watering his lawn, and I saw a woman walking 2 dogs, so there's 2 ands. And I rounded the corner, but then a guy stepped out from behind a truck with a gun pointed at me.
You guys are very violent.
Yes, guns are great for sources of tension or conflict, exactly. But I mean, what can you say? We're former scientists. Isn't that what you just taught us in the last talk, that scientists are characterized by violence and killing? Exactly, there you go. Okay, so that was my story, and I stop it with, but then a guy stepped out and pointed a gun at me, and now we've established a source of tension or conflict. Now we posed a question, which is what happened, and now we will hear from our first volunteer giving us the start of a story. Yay.
I'm excited to tell my own story. So, Randy, I am a Christmas fiend, and I was thrilled to talk my husband into getting our first real tree ever last year. But I never expected it to land me in the emergency room.
And that's all we need. A story has begun, which we really would like to know more, like what happened to put you in the emergency room, and maybe people ask you that later, but we will now move on to our next volunteer.
My head was down, mucking out the horses' stalls and relishing a long trail ride. But when I turned around, they were gone.
No trail ride today. Yes, exactly. You have started a story, you've hooked us, you've drawn us in, and you've gotten us out of that and mode. You've jumped us into the narrative world. And one more, Dominique.
I haven't really thought about it.
Make it up as you go along.
I really like you, Randy, and I was looking forward to discussing the Flocododos, but I wasn't expecting having to improv in front of all of you.
Perfect. There you go. That's it. And that poses the question, which is, what are you going to do about it? Therefore, you're going to come up here and throw me off the stage, okay? Exactly. And, one of the fascinating things that we're seeing in this workshop with this ABT, as these students and faculty begin to absorb it, is the sensitization to those 3 words. And I'm starting to get emails back from people watching movies and shows and things and saying, you know what, this is an and thing. I'm beginning to realize the reason this is so boring, they're just going, and here about the, and so they're getting sensitized to the and pattern. They're getting sensitized to the word but. They're beginning to realize there's a little kind of twinge of joy when somebody says, but you realize we're going into something interesting here. We've got a source of tension or conflict. A story's begun. And most fascinating is the word therefore, where in the workshops, you're beginning to hear people pick up on it and use it as a cue when somebody else is going on and on and on. They say, therefore, what's this all about? So it is a cue to bring it to a point and give it some meaning. Here's a little tidbit of neurophysiology work to kind of back this up, because everybody loves neurophysiology these days to, kind of justify patterns that we're talking about in communication. But this is pretty cool. It's work from Yuri Hassan at Princeton University. An entire field they've created they call neurocinematics, where they basically show people film clips that do and don't have narrative structure, and they look at the brain activity using functional MRI. And very simply, there's a lot more data to the whole study, but I'm just showing you 2 simplified little elements here. They use clips from an Alfred Hitchcock TV show called Bang, You're Dead. It's a suspense show, so there's a very tight narrative to it. And first off, you see lots of brain activity, and then they calculate an index of similarity, and it turns out like 70% level of similarity. Everybody in the audience, they're showing the same brain patterns, and it's not surprising. You go to a suspenseful movie, and everybody's thinking the same way. In contrast, you show people a video clip of just people walking around in a park, and there's very little brain activity, and the index of similarity is 10 to 20%, basically showing you that people's minds are wandering all over the place. So it's just kind of confirming what you could already sort of suspect with common sense. Tell a good, tight story, and everybody will listen. By the way, you mentioned that inaugural event for the Entertainment Exchange, and that Neil deGrasse Tyson gave that opening talk, which I used at the end of my chapter of Don't Be Such a Poor Storyteller, because he told this incredible personal story about the movie Titanic. It's incredibly funny. And it was such a good story, so perfectly structured, that I retold it at a workshop months later, and at the end of 3 days, asked the students if anybody could remember it. Every hand went up. I called on one woman, and she regurgitated it, point for point, identical. And that's the definition of great narrative structure. Once you hit on that structure, people can absorb it immediately, they're comfortable with it, they can take it out, and they can repeat it to other people. That was really a stunning moment to just kind of the proof of what a great communicator he is. So there you go, and, but, and therefore. And so the and the but, and then we set off on a journey, and therefore is really the action of where we're headed to with this journey. And now here's my little personal testimonial, which is that I made this movie, as I said before, Flock of Dodos, and I still did not know how this stuff worked. You know, I'd had it all in film school. I thought I knew it, but it's Malcolm Gladwell's thing, 10,000 hours till you finally get it at that gut level, like, oh my God, that's how it works. So I heard about the controversy in Kansas over the teaching of evolution versus intelligent design, went back there summer 2005, shot 2 weeks worth of interviews, came back, everybody thought the interviews were amazing, and we began editing them together, and for 2 months, all we had was an and structure to it. Here's some stuff about evolution, and here's who Charles Darwin was, and here's the Kansas School Board, and here's this and this and this. And my crew was driven crazy. Every Friday I would force them to watch this thing, and we didn't use this vocabulary. Nobody called it an and. They just were bored to death by it. We finally ended up after 2 months in a giant meltdown, and then I isolated myself for 3 days, and finally in the middle of the second night, I finally cracked the nut. A simple story came to me, which is the story of a guy who sets out on a journey to defend a damsel in distress from the dragon that lives next door to her. He confronts the dragon turns out to be nothing but a harmless teddy bear, and then he realizes the real threat is the big institute up in the Pacific Northwest. That is the central core story that underpins Flock of Dodos. As soon as I recut it with that structure, it worked wonderfully, and from then on, the movie was fun to watch and share with everybody. So that was the divide. In the beginning, I had a collection of sundry facts. Eventually, I managed to crack the nut and get to the narrative. And that was transformative to me, and that's what's led me now into these workshops working on this. So at the core of our workshop now is this app that we've developed, and we have this model that we call the WSP model. And that represents these 3 elements. It's the idea of taking your story, and this helps you crystallize your story. So the first element is there a one-word theme that you can find for your story? Is it a story of survival, of desperation, of carelessness, of hope? Who knows what? Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. The one-sentence summary is this ABT, which we find is incredibly powerful. And then there's a much more detailed thing called the logline maker, which comes from Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey. And there's not time in this presentation to go into it, but if you download the app from Connection, and we've got it free today and tomorrow still, I think, on iTunes. It's called the Connection Story Maker, and it's got some instructions with it. It's extremely simple. That's kind of the power of it, is how simple it is. And there's a share function up there where you can put in your story, and then you can email it to your friends. And there's also a library where you can store your stories, and people are using this now to develop their stories. It's a model for story development, at least. As I say, the word is kind of lightweight. It's like a feather. There's not that much you get out of it. The logline maker, the paragraph, has got 9 elements to it. It's very complex. It's like a 50-pound weight. It will take you much longer to really get a handle on it. But the ABT is the thing right in the middle that we're finding in our workshops, is just instantly catching fire, and it's a valuable tool. So wrapping things up here, what this comes down to is my recommendation, and what I'm pushing for now in the science world, is in some ways kind of like enough of these one-day workshops. This is becoming a problem. People are doing one-day workshops on storytelling where they tell all this complicated stuff and everybody's all excited and there's so much joy and it's a lot of white heat and noise, and they go away, and a week or 2 later, people don't remember it. We had this happen with a major institute that we talked to, and they said, we've already done 2 of these storytelling workshops. We've heard all this before. Well, it's not that simple. You don't get it in a day. This is long-term stuff, committing it, moving it from learning the rules down into the actual intuitive understanding of how they work. So it involves inculcation, repetition, and what Dory and I recommend, and we're starting to do some experiments with some of these people that are asking me to come do the workshop now, is I'm saying, I don't want to do the one-day workshop. I want to do it as a starting point, and then I want 6 to 8 weeks of your group getting back together like every Wednesday morning for 1 hour and doing 5 ABTs and 1 log line, because it's through the repeated use. It's basically like a muscle. You could no more make somebody a great storyteller in 1 day than you could make them buff in a 1-day weightlifting workout. It's the same basic concept. You've got to sustain it over time. And on that note, for no particular reason other than to want to wrap this up with some fun, I got one last clip to show you here. And this may offend some people, but this was one of the clips that I did back, or little short videos I did back in the Shifting Baselines years. And I did a lot of work with the Groundlings Improv Comedy Theater. And that's the place where Will Ferrell came from, and Kristen Wiig, and Phil Hartman, Pee Wee Herman, all of them. So you get to work with the very best comics before they go off to Saturday Night Live or Stardom. So some of you may know Melissa McCarthy now. She's hit it big. This was 10 years ago with her. And I wrote and directed this little thing. It's about 3.5 minutes long. I'm just going to show you the first minute and a half, and I hope some people can appreciate this. She's really tremendously talented. Can we get the lights down for this last little clip?
Dr. Williams, you're telling us that the coral is dying. Is that correct?
Yes, Senator. Around the world.
Has it ever occurred to you that the coral wants to die?
I'm sorry, I beg your pardon?
Dr. Williams, are you actually trying to tell us that this coral dilemma is because of some kind of heating up or warming of the ocean?
Yes, Senator. Seawater temperature is elevated in coastal waters around the globe. If you take a look at my research...
Okay. Where are you getting this from?
From our data.
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 Mm-hmm. Data. Data. Well, that's a big word, isn't it? Big words. That make a little man seem like a big man? Guess what? We can throw big words. So we have data of our own.
And it is telling us that the oceans are getting cold. Very, very cold.
Okay, the ocean is cold. Where do you get those data?
We get those data from our very own expert, and he's a professional doctor.
How's it going, bro?
Okay, there you go. I kind of felt like that embodies some of the discussion, at least for today's cultural divide in the communication of science to the masses. So on that note, anybody got any questions, thoughts, ideas, storytelling, narrative, all that sort of stuff? And thank you.
All right, I have a practical question.
Yes.
Right? So I'm putting together a talk, and I want to include these ABTs.
Yeah.
Do I have an overall or overarching ABT to my talk, or do I go through the log line and then that's the overarching story?
Yeah, great question. So, be careful with the log line. And it gets taught, this is one of the problems, a lot of these workshops, it's a fun, exciting, complicated thing. So the log line gives you 9 blanks to fill in as a template, and it begins with, in an ordinary world, a flawed protagonist has a catalytic event happen that upends their world, and you fill in the blanks with each of those things. What's your ordinary world? Who's your flawed protagonist? What's the catalytic event? It's really fun to fiddle around with. If you download the app, you can do that. But the problem is, really making a story work well will take you weeks or months. That's the challenge of a big, complicated story. The ABT is incredibly robust, and one little catchphrase I like to say is it stands for always be telling stories. And the more you can look for narratives in everything, and they're there, but they're square pegs. You put all your information together, then it's up to you to sit there and stare at this stuff. And that's why sometimes physical activity is important. You'll read about a lot of the greatest scientists. What did they do? They went and took long walks in between their sessions in their lab. They would take in the cerebral part, and the long walks is really the equivalent of improv. It's pulling you down out of your head, down into these lower organs where you get it, the intuition starts to kick in, you put these pieces together. And so increasingly, I am thinking that stories really have got a fractal nature to them with the ABT. Because out of, what's the idea of a fractal? Out of simplicity can arise complexity. You get this simple little algorithm that you radiate up at all these scales, and you get these complex patterns. And it's the same thing with storytelling. Take a look at, an episode of Breaking Bad, and there's a scene with an ABT where Walt comes in and Skyler's all happy, and everything seems good, but then she says, Walt, why do you have 2 cell phones? And therefore he storms out. And there's your ABT within that little scene. And then if you follow that episode, you'll find it at the next scale and the next scale, and you follow the 5 seasons, on and on and on like that. So you can find them and piece them together like that, but they're not going to jump out at you. It's narrative, it's again, it's all the way back to what we just did here. When I asked them to do the ABT on the painting, you saw it takes extra energy. Yes?
Hi, first a comment, then a comment/question.
Sure.
The comment is, I agree that Gettysburg Address has an ABT structure to it.
Yes.
And the components are there, but I would put them in different locations.
Therefore,
I'll tell you about it afterwards.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Okay.
But the comment/question is that seeing the narrative structure of what's going on in front of you really helps with the absorption, as you've been saying.
Yes. And you gave us that great little bit yesterday on proposals, right?
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And so, yeah, by the way, yesterday we did a workshop yesterday morning, and at the break he came up and talked to me about this is all the same stuff that you got to use in order to make grant proposals work. And I asked him to talk for 3 or 4 minutes at the beginning of the second part, which is you talked about NIH, I think, and yeah, all the same basic elements. And so, but sorry, I mentioned that because what I get a lot is scientists coming up to me and saying, you know, I'm not going to get involved with outreach, and that's for other people, so I don't see any relevance here. And your answer to them is this is relevant to everything to do with science. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So when I was in I don't know, 7th grade or something, we diagrammed sentences.
Yeah.
They don't do that anymore. But what that helped me do, I think, was to look at the narrative structure of the individual sentence. And that, I think, really helped my writing. It helped with a lot of other things. Is there any way to teach narrative structure at the earliest stages so that kids start to recognize the structures of the arguments that are coming towards them?
Exactly. I'm glad you asked that question because here's a crazy, bizarre story, which is I made a movie called Flock of Dodos, and towards the end of that movie, I interviewed a guy named Jerry Graff, who's a professor in the English department at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and he published a book called Teaching the Conflicts, and it was cited in the middle of the intelligent design stuff, so I just plugged him into my story at Flock of Dodos. Then last year, I ended up having a woman who just graduated from American University read a draft of Connection, and she said, you didn't cite Jerry Graff's book, They Say, I Say, and I hadn't heard that he'd come out with another book. And by the way, his book, so I'm telling you this because it's right on the point of what you're saying there. He wrote it with his wife. Last summer, they sold their 1 millionth copy. It's used in college courses across the country. It's probably in several courses here. And it's the main text for argumentation, teaching that to undergraduates. And it's the use of templates in argumentation. Their book has an appendix with about 20 of these templates, but it's all the same thing. And then the two of them and I traded a bunch of emails and had a discussion last fall, and we're on the same plane with all of this. But the interesting thing is at the beginning of their book, which is very broadly written, they begin by saying, one of the criticisms we get is this is so elementary. We got this stuff in grade school. Why are you forcing at the college level to go back to this? Well, you didn't get it. You didn't really get it down. These things are so simple and powerful that there's no reason, unless you really have got them at the intuitive level, let's keep working on it. And you're right. I mean, one of the crazy things was Dory last fall took the ABT with those paintings, with some other ones, to a class of like 100 sixth graders, and they were jumping out of their seats. And that's one of the crazy things we see when we do these workshops. It turns out communications workshops with sixth graders is tremendous because they're so uninhibited. They all run at you. And then you do it with adults, and half of them are like, I don't get this. What is this stuff? I don't know. It's a little distressing. Yes?
Very nice talk. Thank you. I
Thanks.
was really interested that the average ABT was 300 to 350 characters.
Yeah.
So if I do want to tweet, and I'm limited to 140, what would you leave out? An AB, a BT, an AT?
I mean, I think if you look at lots of tweets, you'll see there are pieces of those exactly. And you saw with our little start a story thing, that was the only and in the butt. And of course, with all the abbreviations, you could scrunch it, probably get it way down. But I don't think you'd still really get those things down past about 250 or something like that. But it's a different dynamic going on. But the question is, will there be a long-term bias against Twitter because of these narrative principles? And the idea that storytelling is dead is something that crops up, every 10 to 15 years or something. The postmodern era is one of the big themes. Oh, we're past storytelling. This year, in the Super Bowl commercials, the whole big story was all the best commercials told stories once again. Storytelling is universal. It is probably eternal, and that's why it's so important to learn. Yes. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Right.
Yeah, I think that
this is a brilliantly powerful tool, so powerfully brilliant that all I really want to know now is what happened after the tree fell, or how did you, what happened? All I can think of is what happened. You don't have to really
Finish the story. Go ahead. Tell us. Oops.
We purchased a stand that had spikes in the bottom of it, and our communication and teamwork failed a bit, and I ended up with one of the spikes going through my finger, through the nail, through the bone.
Yikes.
So blood and guts, even better.
Yikes. The stakes are raised.
We admitted we're violent.
Perfect, yes.
Thanks for a great talk.
Sure.
The question is, part of what science is, I think, is trying to sort of quantify our uncertainty about different sort of ideas, and sort of tying the different talks together. Take the sort of debates or controversies over climate change and evolution. Those are cases where scientists do have a consensus. There's very little uncertainty now. But most of sort of science, there's a lot of gray area. And I know you can do it, but how do you think about reconciling? Because one of the dangers maybe of storytelling is squashing down that uncertainty, sort of saying we have an answer. So does a resolution, does that work? Can you sort of, how do you take a story where you've got a new piece of data that might help you think about it, but you're still quite uncertain? How do you turn that into a narrative?
Sure, that's, with my movie Sizzle, Global Warming Comedy, that's really probably the most common question that comes up in the Q&As on that. You know, how do we deal with uncertainty? Everybody's agonized over that. I haven't heard any generalized answer, so I will offer up my answer from my perspective, which, keep in mind, is probably vastly different from the vast majority of the whole science communication crowd, because I went off on this path less traveled. I went off for 25 years into a completely different weird world, and I now come back around from a different perspective. But I view narrative as the be-all and end-all, and one of the things we know for basic narrative principles is when you read a novel, there's this omniscient voice, and there's no uncertainty in the narrator's voice. And if you ever read a story and the narrator is telling you, you know, this took place in Florida. Oh, no, wait, maybe it was Alaska. Oh, no, I don't remember where it was. That would be fun and artsy, but you just don't see it much because that doesn't work for effective communication, which means that there's good reason to be terrified of uncertainty and work with it very delicately. And I think the movie Inconvenient Truth just ran fast and loose with it. You know, they had it all through that movie. Maybe Florida's going to flood, maybe not, maybe this, maybe that, maybe that. The general public starts to get lost. We don't know what story you're telling us. We need these clear narratives. By the way, a little side comment. You know, I think what Bill Nye's doing is unbelievable right now, and I was here this morning, and that's a guy who's found his core narrative thread. And by the way, narratives and branding, pretty much one and the same. He's created this brand that it's super clear who he is, what he stands for. He's a great, trusted, and liked voice. That's what the science world has been needing, and that's the goal. That's why these narratives are so important.
I just finish up with, you know,
Sure.
in movies I could think of one, for example, the end of The Graduate. They leave you with a resolution that has uncertainty built into it, right? It's not clear what's going to happen to those people on the bus.
Yes.
But sort of turning that into a sort of, I mean, Inconvenient Truth, the problem was it was spread throughout the movie, so
Yes.
it's not clear what.
Okay, towards that end, I would guide you to the third chapter of my book about storytelling, my first book, and I put in there McKee's Triangle, it's called, and it is the model. Robert McKee is the kind of major best-selling, he's a tremendous screenwriting instructor in Hollywood nowadays, really in the practical sense. And in his book Story, he has this model that is a triangle, and at the top of the triangle is what he calls arc plot, which is the ultimate, biggest, broadest, most powerful plot, which is basically what Joseph Campbell outlined as the monomyth, that one storyline with all of its characteristics that's going to reach the masses, that's going to be Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and all those sorts of things. And there's 7 or 8 characteristics he lists in there, one of which is a closed ending. And that's what will get you to the top of the mountain for the biggest, broadest audience. Titanic, all those movies have a closed ending. Down in the left corner is what he calls mini plot, which is the more art house films, and that's one of the characteristics is open endings, the possibility. And so I would suggest to you that, you know, The Graduate was a great film, but it was not a giant blockbuster, and that's one of the elements, you know, and that's the trade-off. You don't want just these blockbusters, but we know these basic characteristics of them. Yes?
Hi, I just have more of a comment, really. So yeah, this is just a very interesting topic to me. I'm a medical illustrator myself, and
Cool.
and so in graduate school we talked about how as medical illustrators we're storytellers and we're translators. So it's just interesting to compare. I'm used to hearing that in more the visual sense, And so it's nice to see what this more literally means. And so I'm just curious how I'll go back to the office and, how it can be applied to my own work.
Well, and think about that little exercise with the painting in the ABT there.
Right, yeah.
Look at what that's doing. Again, it's sort of passive to just describe something of everything that's in the picture. It's really active to force somebody to kick their brain in and start assembling what story is going on here. And that's what the ABT guides you to. And you could maybe do that with medical illustrations as well.
Yeah, I'm curious how it'll...
Yeah, and at the core of that is find what is your narrative? What's your point you're trying to make with this illustration? We're trying to make the point, you got to be real careful with this stuff. Is there an illustration you could have that you could force people to give the ABT of that, and in doing that, they would hit that moment of realization, like, oh my goodness, this is what this is about.
Right.
So
It's such a big partner to storytelling, definitely.
yeah, I think the overall point of all this stuff is that it just takes a ton of work.
Yeah.
And I didn't go through the whole case study last fall. What led me to that letter in Science was a panel discussion on sea level rise that I was brought in to do a makeover on it with these two senior scientists. And they were both tremendous, charismatic speakers, but almost nobody's got this narrative instinct, well enough. And it's a group process. And working with them, we reshaped it, and we put on the panel for 1,000 people, and it kind of brought the roof down. And people walked up just dazed, like, wow, everything interconnected and all built to these arcs and all this sort of stuff. And that's the power of narrative, of that. So
yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
One of the things that I really liked about both Flock of Dodos and Sizzle was the use of humor. And
thanks.
And
Bill Nye this morning.
Right,
yes.
and including that very uncomfortable making poker game where I saw myself and my colleagues. So the question I have is, where in this whole business does humor fit in? Is that the butt? Is that, No, I didn't quite mean it that way.
Yeah, no, that's good. the butt of the point. So where humor would fit in is if my partner, Brian Palermo, were here, who's a comic actor, and he does the improv work. And you can break these stories into these two elements, not just cerebral and visceral, but also structure and character. And it's kind of the same thing. Structure is all the stuff we're talking about here, plot, basically, and but, and therefore the 3-act structure. That's the more scientific side, the more analytical side. It's very cool. You can analyze it. But then there's this other element, which is character, and that's all of these things of, what do the people look like, what do they sound like, what do they dress like. Everything to do is basically accuracy. And by the way, the science world chooses to put all of its focus in communication on the character side, making sure first and foremost everything's accurate, and then secondarily we'll get to this story structure stuff. And what I'm advocating is to try and give both of them up to the level of an A+. But humor, first off, is extremely likable. And one of the guys I'm fond of quoting is Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, who spoke at one of the big National Academy of Science events 2 years ago. And he won the Nobel Prize for his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And he said to all the scientists there, at the end of his whole speech, he said, after we go through all this sort of stuff, at the end of the day, none of your data is going to amount to anything unless you go to the public with a voice that has two qualities, that is trusted and liked. And that's what you got to have. You can't go to the public with somebody they don't trust or they don't like. They're not going to listen to anything. And so humor is enormously likable. And that's where that fits into the overall picture, which is, want to get an audience. Again, look at Bill Nye this morning. That was incredible. He's really funny. Everybody just loved him. There's your demonstration of the power of that. And the other thing that Brian would then tell you also is there are studies that show that laughter releases endorphins and people get addicted to endorphins. And so they're literally sitting there waiting, give me some more. Give me like the rat in the maze hitting the bar. Tell me another joke. So it's got that dynamic as well.
The word storytelling brings an awful lot to me, although I'm being a little bit interdisciplinary at this point because I'm not a scientist. But I spent a good number of years doing storytelling for young people. I would venture to say that most parents and grandparents here, or librarians, would recognize your sequence within a story that we almost all know, The Three Bears. We said it.
Oh, yeah.
We say something happens, and we say, therefore, what happened? However, you just answered a question I had while I was standing in line. Right. In the area of science, if you're putting it into that format, you really have to be accurate. Is that right?
Yes.
Whereas The Three Bears can go off, or many of the stories, our classics, can be very flights of fancy. Yeah. I just wanted to kind of point out what I was thinking of when you were doing it, because so much of it related to some of our regular experiences and translated into the field of science is very exciting to me.
Well, it's painful, that dimension of it. And I paid the price in blood for what you're talking about there, because I made a movie called Flock of Dodos where everything's accurate in it. and it's got a lot of information content, and the distributors looked at it and they just said, you know, it's not that provocative, and it's got an awful lot of information in it, and none of them wanted to pick it up. We finally got it onto Showtime, thankfully, but that was a struggle. And you know, one of the pivotal experiences for me in my whole journey was 1990 when I was a new professor at the University of New Hampshire. Spike Lee came and talked to 1,000 students. His movie, Do the Right Thing, had just come out. And it was such an amazing, candid thing. He just sat up there with a microphone, told true stories of Hollywood, and he said these people out there, they don't care about anything accurate, because his battle was to try and tell true, accurate stories of the African American community and the voice of an African American. And he just said over and over again, you wouldn't believe every script you give them, they'll say, this is great, make it stupider. And I listened to that in shock back then. It's now 24 years later for me, everything he said was true. You know, you just wouldn't believe it. Look at Discovery Channel, National Geographic on a daily basis, you know. Take it, whatever you got, let's make it stupider. It's very disappointing at that point, but that's the battle that you're up against, and it's really, really tough. But the bottom line is that you can make powerful media if you're willing to invest the time, energy, and resources to crack these nuts within the bounds of accuracy. But you got this extra burden. It's so difficult. The last thing I'll say, actually, is that, for example, that silly little film, the Senate hearing with the groundlings, none of the groundlings have ever thought any of my films are all that funny. Because, you know, basically every film they do, they're going to eventually want to take it into anal sex or something crazy and wild and all that, just over the top. They want to escalate things up to complete insanity, and when I work with them, I'm constantly after restraining them. You know, we can't do that. It's gonna just distort the whole thing. Nobody's going to hear anything. And as a result, my films, and I could see when we're doing the films, you know, if I were to do this, everybody'd be roaring with laughter, but you'd lose the whole point. So it's this balancing act between message and agenda. And if I could say one last little thing, then I think we're done here, aren't we? But last little thing I wanted to mention that I also found fascinating was last year, Randy Atkins from National Academy of Engineering had me come and do a thing with the Disney Prodcom Masters. It's a competition that Disney does with a big corporation across the country, like 5,000 6th to 9th graders all competing in their science projects, and they brought the 12 finalists out there. And they brought me down there initially to do 3 hours of communication workshop with them, and then a couple days later as well, actually it's only gonna be 2 hours. And then as I drove down there, they called me up and said, actually we're gonna have to just cut it to 1 hour. So my whole vision shrunk down. And that was the birth of the WSP model, was that I said, what can I do? All right, I'm just gonna go in there and give them a piece of paper and have them come up with the one word, the one sentence, the one paragraph. And so I actually had written on paper the 9 elements of the log line. And so they all did the one word, they all did the sentence, the ABT, that was all great. And then as I walked around the circle passing out these pages that had the 9 blanks to fill in, before I could get finished and to come up to the front and explain it to them, all I heard behind me was them saying, oh, this thing. And they were instantly filling in the hero's journey, basically. And it made me realize in an instant, they lived their lives in this narrative world, and this is not alien to them. In contrast, when we do the workshop with adults, half of them lock up, like, what is this thing, you know, and a flawed protagonist, all that sort of stuff. And I found that really fascinating, that they took to it so quickly, they didn't even need instruction, and that's maybe a key insight into, I think, communicating, or training some of the younger folks in communication, an open door, so.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.